You're watching BCTV. We're all about Brantford. You're watching BCTV, Brantford Government Television, a service of Brantford Community Television. This program is brought to you in part through the support of the town of Brantford.
Okay, we're going to get started. Town of Brantford Board of Finance meeting, June 24th, 2019. First on the agenda is to approve minutes of the May 20th, 2019 meeting.
I'll move we accept.
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded. Any discussion, comments, corrections? All in favor?
Aye.
Next is citizens' comments, citizens' communication, and we ordinarily allocate a short amount of time for folks to comment on the agenda items, and we have one taker, Peter.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Just real quick, I'll be interested in the transfer out of monies that were set aside prospectively for teachers' retirements going into tennis courts rather than what we've done in the past, putting it into police pension or an OPEB account, which seems to me closer to the intent of what retirement figure should be. Thank you.
Okay, that was Peter Black, RTM member and citizen, resident. Thank you, Peter. Any other citizens' comments? Comments from the public? Okay, if not, then we will proceed to number 3, which is to hear a presentation from Hooker and Holcomb with regards to the actuarial evaluation of performance of the town's post-retirement medical plan, which is affectionately known as OPEB. And we've got Steve Leminski with us today. Welcome.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you, members of the board, for inviting me here tonight to talk about the 2018 valuation. I believe you all received copies of the actual report in advance, and you should also have a handout that looks like this, which is what I'd like to use to kind of walk through the results tonight. And just before I go through the presentation, page 2, I have an agenda, kind of highlights what I'm going to talk about tonight, a little bit about the purpose of the valuation, why are we here, summarize the results, talk about a survey which will be released actually later this week. You're going to be the first board to actually see a couple of the charts that are going to go into that report. Talk about the funded status of the OPEB plan, development of the funding contribution, summary of some projected benefit payments from the fund, a little bit about the data. I'll go through some details on the investment return assumption, how we develop it, and then some things to think about for the next valuation in 2020. Page 3, and again just for general education, when we talk about OPEB, it's an acronym for Other Post-Employment Benefits. So in the employee benefits world, other means other than pension. Okay, so we're talking about post-retirement health care, medical, dental. Every so often we'll see post-retirement life insurance. You don't have that in your plan, but if you did, that would be an evaluation as well. This page 3, the point of it is to talk about the town's funding cost over the life of the plan. So money in has to equal money out over the life of the plan. So money out would be benefits paid to retirees, any administrative expenses you might incur, and a couple offsets to that cost. This is the main benefit of an OPEB trust fund. Obviously, any investment earnings you can generate on that trust fund will offset your ultimate cost. And if there are any member contributions, generally for OPEB, we're talking about retiree cost sharing. Every now and then we'll see active members contribute as well. But that's the lifetime cost of the plan, and what the valuation does every 2 years for you is take a snapshot of where the plan sits in terms of its status. And we also develop the town's funding contribution, which is otherwise known as the ADEC. You'll see that term. It's done for the upcoming 2 years. All right. So that's an overview of what the valuation is all about. Page 4 summarizes the results as of July 1st, 18. I like to always summarize where the liability sits, and this distribution is not unusual for a municipality. Police and fire generally tend to have the lion's share of the liability. In this case, about 72% combined. On average, they retire sooner than general employees, and they enjoy those benefits for the longest period of time. So those two factors combined tend to give you this kind of distribution. In terms of what happened since 2016 on the liability side, the majority of your active employees are now covered by a high deductible health plan. And again, that's not unusual in the state of Connecticut. We see that almost all the time. In this case, that reduced the town's liability versus what it would have been by just under 13%. Okay, so on the liability side of the balance sheet, those numbers went down. We did look at some assumptions, and I'll talk about those in greater detail in a moment. I've got them listed here on page 4. You were one of the earlier adopters in the state in terms of an OPEB trust. We've been recognizing that since the 2010 valuation. The current GASB standards came out about 10 years ago, so very early in terms of most municipalities. I have a couple graphs here, but 43% of OPEB plans in Connecticut are now being funded via OPEB trust. So you still have 57% that have not set up a trust, which is the point of reference. And your funded ratio is excellent. It's almost 57% as of 2018. That's actually up from 44% last time around. So measured against all plans in the state of Connecticut, you are, measured against all funded plans in the state of Connecticut, you're in the top 12%. Measured against all plans, including unfunded plans, you're in the top 6%. Okay, so pretty rarefied air in that regard. The graphs that I was mentioning before, starting on page 5, this has a distribution of all the plans in the state, okay, both funded and unfunded. So the way you read this, the funded ratio shown down the horizontal axis, so the tallest bar, those with 0%, those are all the plans that have yet to set up a trust. So there's 57% of the plans. You can see the distribution there in 20% buckets. So you are in the bucket 40 to 59.9%. Okay. And if we turn to page 6, what this graph shows is just the plans that are funded. So we've taken out the 57%. Recalculated distribution, so 45% of the funded plans are under 20% funded. They're just kind of getting started. You are in the third bucket from the left, 18%. You're at 56.9%. Okay. Any questions on those?
Not on these, Steve, but does the state of Connecticut have any regulations as to the OPEB funds?
In terms of
like who they're going to cover, what you can invest in, anything like that?
There are, on the Board of Education side, in terms of what gets offered to teachers and administrators, by statute, they have to be offered basically benefits at the same premium level as the active members. And in terms of changes to those benefits post-retirement under Connecticut statute, you're not allowed to change those benefits once somebody's retired.
And as far as the investments,
Yeah, in terms of the investments, Charlie, actually, I do have some familiarity with this. As Steve was talking about kind of the history of OPEB in Connecticut, there was a time where there was no statutory authority to set up OPEB trust funds. And so myself and the finance director from East Hartford petitioned the legislature to amend statute 7450. 7450 governed pensions, and because the OPEB and the pensions were very similar in terms of their structure and in terms of what they were designed to do, we just included OPEB trust in the same enabling legislation as pensions. So basically, the OPEB trust has all the investment flexibility as a pension plan would have.
That's why it's called a trust fund then, rather than a pension plan?
Well, a pension is a trust fund also. It's more Steve's area, but, you know, it's a trust set up for the exclusive benefit of the participants. So it's a trust as opposed to a reserve fund where at some point you could actually, under certain circumstances, cancel it.
Okay. Sorry, Steve.
Okay. So page 7 goes into a little bit more detail about the assumptions we looked at this time around. It's it's standard operating procedure really for us to take a look at the assumptions. We're constantly evaluating kind of a long-term view of the world in terms of both the asset side, which is the discount rate. That's an estimate of the long-term rate of return for the trust. So that was changed from 6 3/4 to 6.5% for this valuation. And all firms that are involved in investments, we have a division called HHIA, H&H Investment Advisors, develop capital market assumptions, which are basically long-term views on asset class returns. So whether that's equities or fixed income, emerging market equities, real estate, and so forth. So based on our capital market assumptions currently, and I have details on this a few slides back, we believe that a rate in the 6 1/4 to 6 3/4% range is reasonable. Based on the same survey that we're publishing this week, the median for Connecticut public sector funded plans is currently 6 3/4. So you're a little bit more conservative than the median plan in terms of that assumption. Excuse me, the impact of that change, all else being equal, to increase the actual liability in this valuation by about 3.2%. The other assumptions were based on emerging experience. Society of Actuaries, which is the governing body for the work that we do, they periodically publish updated estimates of life expectancies. They're actually updating that now every year. They do something called a projection scale, which is how those expectancies are projected to change in the future, because you're covering not only current retirees, but active employees who will retire 10, 20, 30 years down the road. So we need to know what their life expectancies look like. So we updated that based on the most recent schedule. In terms of retirement assumptions, we had made some changes when we did the pension valuation for the police and mapped those changes over to this valuation on the OPEB sides to be consistent. OPEB election, unlike pensions where members contribute contractually during their employment, they get a pension based on a formula and then they satisfy eligibility and they start collecting. Retirees on the OPEB side have to make a decision, particularly when cost sharing is involved. So they may have to contribute in some cases up to 100% of the premium in order to get the OPEB benefits. So we make an assumption about how likely it is that somebody will say yes, because they may have coverage elsewhere, they may have spouses coverage, there might be a whole host of reasons. We did tweak that assumption down a bit based on experience and similar plans that we work on for certain groups. In terms of inflation, this is really based on emerging experience. Social Security's current best estimate, they do an annual report to project solvency for Social Security and Medicare every year. You probably hear about that and read about it. That current best estimate is 2.6% per year long term. So we changed that assumption to be consistent with their estimate, and similarly changed the healthcare cost trend rate assumption downward by 15 basis points to be consistent with the inflation change. So all in, other than the discount rate change, all those changes combined reduced the liability by about 0.8%. So pretty modest impact when you net those together. In terms of the results, page 8 shows a snapshot of the funded status of the plan. So this is how we determine the 57% funded ratio, which are the assets of the plan, off in the far right-hand column, roughly $16.1 million as the valuation date, against an accrued liability of $28.3 million. Okay, so all groups, that's how you get that ratio. On the liability side, you can see the breakdown between current active members and current retirees. If we split that out into percentages, about 59% of your liabilities associated with current active members. You're accruing a cost for that as they're working, okay? And you can see the numbers by group on that page. So we've got the funded status of the plan. The next step for your budget process, again, we're doing this 2 years at a time, fiscal 20, fiscal 21 in this case. We've got to break down the numbers into two pieces. The first piece is called the normal cost. Again, actives accrue this benefit over their career, just like they do for a pension plan. So for fiscal '20, for all groups, that accrual is worth about $1 million. So even if the plan were 100% funded, you're still going to incur that accrual. The balance of it is really a mortgage payment on the unfunded liability. That's the next line item down, about $897,000. Right now you're paying off the liability over 28 years as of July 1, 2018. And a little bit of interest to account for the timing difference between the valuation date and when the money gets paid. So all in, what's called the ADEC, or the town contribution, is about $1.97 million. Okay. That's not new money that's needed. Right now, you're not running those costs through the trust. You're paying them directly. Right now, you're just depositing money in, kind of building the trust up. That's an important point, is shown on the next page, page 10, which is projected pay-as-you-go costs. So for fiscal '20, for the current retirees, it's about $1.06 million. Okay, so you're paying that directly. The ADEC kind of contemplates that you put that money in and then pay that money out, just like you do for the pension plan. So in terms of new money needed, if you were running everything through the trust, it would be the difference between the $1.97 million and the pay-as-you-go cost, about $909,000 in new money. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think where that's relevant is one of the projects that we're going to be looking at over the summer and into the fall is, as this plan is growing in assets, is looking at ways and working with Steve, the actuaries, and our investment folks as to kind of flipping that switch over to see if there's a way we could actually treat it like the pension plan, whereas right now, as Steve pointed out, like most communities who have a trust do, they run it through the medical self-insurance fund, and then the OPEB trust reimburses for whatever those costs were. If the costs happen to be lower that year, the medical self-insurance fund gets the benefit as opposed to the OPEB trust. So that's, that kind of makes sense to think about that differently because of the levels of funding. Whereas before, when we were first starting out, the OPEB trust wouldn't have had enough cash, to carry any blips and changes in the medical insurance. So that's something that we have to figure out, and it might require a little bit of different reporting with Anthem in terms of the cash flows and other things. But it's a project, so but it relates to what Steve was talking about. So.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Questions from the board? In regards to the report, either the full report or the presentation? Jim?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'd like Steve to address, and we've talked about this before, is, and again, this relates to the plan becoming more mature, is when you look on the last page, you'll see that there's 4 recommendations. And the third one, Steve, maybe you could talk a little bit about the asset smoothing. So, for example, in the pension plan, we use an asset smoothing technique of 5 years. So basically, in any given year, we're recognizing 20% of the gains or losses. And that plays a factor in terms of what your contributions will be. And ideally, as the word smoothing suggests, you don't want your contributions going all over the place. So as your plan has more assets that are basically invested, you're more susceptible to the volatility in the market because now your assets are fluctuating in terms of big dollars. So if it was $10 million and it goes down by 10%, it's $1 million. But if when you had a small trust and it was $50,000, it went down by $500,000, it went by $50,000, not so much. But I don't know, Steve, you could probably explain it a little better. But
That's a perfect explanation. That's exactly how I would have said it. Yeah, so basically the $900,000 that we just went over, the amortization payment, that's the piece that can really go up and down if you continue to get market. So the asset level, in our view, is at a point where we think prospectively it makes sense to smooth it, and I'm giving that advice to other clients that are in similar positions. I mean, you've built up to a level where you don't really want that to fluctuate unduly for your budget. Yeah, and just one last point on the, since we're on this page, the last bullet point, we talked a little bit about mortality. Really just subsequent to when this report was released, the Society came out with a new mortality study, which is strictly based on public sector mortality. It's a little bit different than the table we're using now. We'll take a look at it next time around in terms of how it might apply to your group.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Charlie, you got a question?
Yeah, Steve, you going to comment anything about the, the review of the current investment return assumption, the 6.5%?
Yeah, and that's not on there necessarily to suggest that we're recommending a change in that. It's just an ongoing review. So in 2020, based on updated assumptions and any change in inflation expectations, we may or may not recommend or suggest a change to that. But that's just a reminder that we do look at that.
So, but in this valuation, we reduced it from 6.75 to 6.50.
Right.
And the range is running from 6.25 to 6.75 for
Yeah,
all.
yeah.
For all, so we're inside the range. We
Yeah.
actually lowered our assumption.
Right, you're right in the middle. You're, as I showed on the survey, you're actually a little more
Are
conservative.
we doing that well?
Well, this is not how we set the assumption, but just by coincidence, the last 2 years ending on the valuation date was you hit 6.5 for an actual
And
return
that's
over
why you
the
consider a
2.5.
smoothing approach going
Yeah.
down the road, because you don't know what the volatility is.
Yeah.
And you can reduce it to a market, but then you're going to be paying twice as much. So this is where, again, we have a high percentage of funding,
Right.
funded ratio, and we have a conservative approach to the investments. So it's actually served us well.
Yeah.
Other questions or comments? Good. Folks, good. Thank you, Steve. I think we're good.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Okay, next is to hear a request from the tax collector to consider and approve the suspense list for 2013 grand list year.
Thank you.
Welcome, Roberta.
Hello, how's everybody? I trust that all the members of the board received the email that I sent with the actual lists of supplemental motor vehicle and personal property accounts for consideration for suspense, totaling $185,068.09. As I think I said last year, the whole idea behind suspense, you look at it as a deadbeat relative who owes you money, but you're not really expecting to get it. If you get it, it's gravy. So this is just that same listing. The majority of the motor vehicle and motor vehicle sub, we can capture most of those people, because if they're trying to register something, they can't if their taxes are not paid. But these people have either stopped registering something in their name or have moved out of state. So we're still actively with collections, but we just sort of set this money aside, not expecting to get it, but if we get it, it's gravy.
Do we work with motor vehicle departments in other states to capture?
We don't. We don't. We probably should.
It's hard to collect a state in a different state, these types of debts. But
Yeah.
within Connecticut, you can either work with the motor vehicles or with collection agents.
Absolutely. Which is exactly what we do.
So what this does is take it off the receivable.
Help me out, Jim, there's so many different, yeah.
It's not considered an asset of the town, even though it's still collectible.
Right. It's a little misleading where it says it's uncollectible, because technically everything is collectible over 15 years, but it's really unexpected, and we do occasionally, somebody comes in and pays them, but for the most part, the chances of getting them are very slim.
And these are unsecured because there's no liens against them.
Right.
So it's personal property, motor vehicle. So there's very little chance, but it's still active. Questions?
Hey, Roberta, is the total 185, is that up or down?
It's up. It's actually up about $16,000 from last year. Motor vehicle itself was only up about $1,300 from the amount last year. Motor vehicle surprised me. That was up like $5,100. I don't know where all these people are, what kind of cars they're driving. Personal property was only up about $10,000 from last year's suspense list.
Hey, do you know whether we publish the name of each individual in the annual report?
We do not.
Okay.
You think we should?
Probably, transfer to these items.
Motion to move this to suspense from Victor,
I'll second it.
seconded by Jeff. Continued questions or discussion?
Just
Bob?
one question. So, once it goes into suspense, we continue to work this?
We do still continue collection efforts, and if we get it, it's
Yeah, Are we
great.
doing it here, or are we sending it to an outside firm?
We do have a collection agency, American National Collection Group, that we work with, and of course, we always, send out the delinquents and the past due notices, but again, a lot of these people have either moved out of state or just don't register anything in their own name anymore.
Thanks.
Thanks, Bob. Questions? Any other questions from the tax collector? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Thank you, you're all set?
Thank you. Have a good night.
You too now, thank you. Okay, next is to consider and if appropriate, approve a request from the Board of Police Commissioners for the following fiscal 2019 budget transfers. From parts, $3,319. From regular wages and salaries, $275. From radio communication, $2,388. From purchase services, $1,627 for a total of $7,609. Going into furniture, $3,319. Accumulated sick, $112. Professional development, $163. Communications, $2,388. And equipment, $1,627 for a total of $7,609. Welcome, Chief Mulhern.
Good evening. Just to run down on the furniture line, the overage was a result of an existing charge to that line for the incoming deputy chief. When I came in, I guess there wasn't office furniture. And also the purchase of an evidence processing station that we were in need of. The slight overage in the accumulated sick time was a result of an unexpected retirement from an officer and had like literally 2 hours sick time on the bank, in the books to be paid out. Professional development, the 163, was a result of a dispatcher certification course that there was a dispute with one of our vendors, whether it was valid, and we had to send the dispatcher at the last minute. And the communications, 2388, our phone system was upgraded and replaced, thankfully. And as part of that, that drove the need to have some renewed licensing on our recorder system. The vast majority of all our phone lines need to be recorded, and that resulted in an expense that was, quite frankly, unexpected. And lastly, on the equipment, the 1627 was from the need for digital recorders. Our officers dictate their reports in the cars. They use these proprietary recorders that are downloaded into an internal system, and the transcriptionists take it from there. Some of them were damaged, and others needed oncoming officers. So that's where that came from.
Okay, questions on this transfer?
I'll move it.
Moved by
Second.
Bob, seconded by
Jeff.
Jeff. Discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
I'd just like to make a comment to our chief.
Sure.
A couple of weeks ago, he participated in the Special Olympics in terms of working with the awards program to the recipients. So I think Brantford is very proud of you for doing that. And I know those young people
Yeah.
enjoy it.
Very proud.
There were just a few chiefs.
We were
compared to all
the
chiefs that are in Connecticut, but
number one
congratulations.
fundraiser in the state of Connecticut this year, thanks to the Brantford officers. A lot of hard work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks for mentioning that, Harry, and thank you, Chief. Item number 6 is to consider and, if appropriate, approve a request from the Board of Police Commissioners for the following 2019 budget transfer from continuing education, $10,000, supernumerary training, $5,320, regular wages and salaries, $29,200, for a subtotal of $44,520. Transfer into ballistic vests, $44,520, and the corresponding fund creation, transfer, or increasing the capital account by $44,520 and authorizing the purchase of equipment for $44,520. Chief?
So this is something that historically, the Police Benevolent Association, along with the union, has reimbursed, I say marginally reimbursed officers for their ballistic vests. And this has kind of created a replacement cycle issue, and there's also an interpretation by ConOSHA that a ballistic vest is protective personal equipment, thus the obligation falls on the municipality or the department to provide that. These vests are good for a 5-year life cycle. If they're exposed to a significant amount of sun and/or moisture, they will degrade. And in looking at this, I felt it was something that we need to take ownership on. So we'll have a structured 5-year replacement cycle, and we're assuring the level and the quality of the vest for our officers. And with that interpretation of OSHA, there is some process going on with other municipalities in their interpretation of that. So I felt it was best to bring this forward and, get into a cycle where we buy them. Now, the $44,520, we will get a 50% reimbursement through the Department of Justice Bulletproof Grant Partnership Program. This is a long-standing program. It's a reliable program. I was able to make application. We should see funds in September, and going forward, they will reimburse us 50%. So we're really looking at a $22,000 or, a manufacturing increase over the next 5 years. So the overall cost should be 50% of what you see. It's a very reliable program. I've used it and been part of it for at least 9 years. So we should see that.
Okay. Jim, when those funds come in, they go into this fund that you've created here?
Yes, this fund that's being set up would accept operating transfers in and grants also.
So that'll act as reserve for future purchases?
And then we would look at that balance and decide how much to put in to keep the cycle going.
Gotcha. Okay. Questions, Bob?
Yeah, Chief, what is it per vest? What's the cost?
It was 810. It's under state contract. It was down to $795, I believe, $795 a vest. And that's on the current state contract, which we should be able to get our orders in under that. If not, it'll go up to
You'll just keep
810.
things rolling from there as you indicated, so.
Yeah, my recollection is they've stayed 740, 750, 760, and they've but this level vest is where we need to be and provides enough comfort. Obviously we can get much higher protection, but then it becomes too cumbersome to wear, and we run into those issues. So this is a very good quality. It's not, the lowest one you can get, but it's also certainly not the highest.
Great, thanks.
Charlie?
Yeah, this is enough to get the first buy? It's
Yeah.
44?
Yep.
Any idea what the cycle, I know you said it's a 5-year life, but do you think it's going to be around 44 every year?
No, so we get 5 years out of them.
Yeah, but then next year, you're going to have some expiring at the end of 5 years.
These are all brand new.
Yeah, so,
Oh, you mean you haven't had any?
well, there are officers that have them, and they're at various stages of their life cycle, and quite frankly, some of them are probably exceeding that life cycle. So it is beneficial to do it in one bulk purchase, so we stay on that. Some departments will stagger it, but when we buy large quantities, we tend to get better results from the vendors, get better interest.
I got it.
And just for accountability, it makes it a little easier. And we will see, a few new hires here and there, someone will retire. These are, the vast majority of people, these are end user specific. You cannot take my vest and give it to someone else. And there are new guidelines on mandatory fitting procedures. If you do try to reuse one and it's not right, you'll tend to expose the lower abdomen area, which is problematic, and also under the arms if it's not fitted right. And under the arm, believe it or not, is a very vulnerable place. So it is good to keep them all together and just move on from here very cleanly.
Very good, thanks.
That's about 56 units.
56, correct, yep.
Okay, other questions?
it without that?
I'll move it. Moved by Victor,
Second.
seconded by Jeff. Discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Thanks, Chief.
Thank you for your time.
Okay, number 7 is to consider and if appropriate approve a request from the Registrar of Voters for the following budget transfer from professional development, $2,800, from moving and storage, $360, purchase services, $822, furniture and fixtures, $940, contingency, $12,003, for a total of $16,925, transferring into clerical support, $6,000, election workers, $7,000, other supplies, $2,900, meal supplies, $1,025, for a total of $16,925. And Jim, what's the contingency balance?
With the items on your agenda tonight, if all those were allocated, you'd have a balance of 168,193.
Okay, thank you. And nobody from the registrar is here. Are you representing this, Mr. Finch or Mr. Cosgrove?
I have the letter that I believe already received for,
Yes, from Marion
Marion.
and Mr. Halley.
and I believe Mr. Halley was going to attend tonight, but perhaps he can't make it. So, as stated in the letter, there was a change in 2 locations, voting locations this past election season, which required them to, the registrars to send out a number of notices informing everybody. They were to the 2 projects going on. Walsh Intermediate School, that voting district was moved to Tisco, and the community house was moved to the high school. So the multiple notices went to all registered voters on that. There was also, I believe they came in during their presentation and spoke about having to supply meals because they're not allowed, those who are working at the polling locations are not allowed to leave the polling locations. They're there throughout the day. And where they used to just rely on a crock pot sitting in the corner, they don't have that luxury anymore on these new locations, so they are now providing a meal to each of the poll workers, which is built into their budget moving forward. So that is and just the overall added needed for support due to election day registration and some other, just the amount of people attending the vote in the last election required them to have additional registers.
Thanks, Jamie. Questions from Jamie on this transfer? So we want to move it?
Move it.
Moved by
Harry.
Harry, seconded by Bob. Discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Thanks, Jamie. Number 8 is to consider and if appropriate approve a request from wastewater treatment plant superintendent to enter a 3-year contract with the option for 1 additional year with All American Waste for the disposal of pre-treatment waste from the wastewater treatment plant. Dan, how are you?
Yeah, good morning, gentlemen, or good afternoon, good evening. There we go, we got
There
it.
you go.
You get there.
I'll get there sooner or later. Yeah, I would like your favorable opinion on a 3-year contract with a possible 2-year extension with All American Waste We have been with them for, since '08. They've been hauling our special waste. It's a permitted waste. They're a pretty good company. They've kept their prices the same throughout the whole contract time. And so I'd like to kind of keep it going. We did get a favorable bid waiver from the Board of Selectmen. So we got to come to you guys to look it over and give us the Alexa Hente.
And this has been reviewed by council?
Yes, this is just, well, the contract is an extension of the current contract that we have, so that was previously reviewed. So it's just an extension of terms.
So the
Yeah.
value of this is
Yes.
approximately $24,000 a year?
And that's what it's been. And that depends on the usage.
Okay, this is coming to us with a favorable recommendation. Any questions from the board?
Hey, Dan, do you know what not automatic means on the renewal?
Oh, that means that once we're up to 3 years, when they have the 2-year option,
Yeah,
it's
that's
not
what-
automatic. It's got to be approved by
Oh, not
IRS.
approved, I mean, they can boost the price on you.
No,
They can't.
I don't think so. It's supposed to stay the remainder. Unless something changes and they're going to have a problem, but they can't do it for 3 years.
Okay.
Been moved by Victor,
Second.
seconded by Jeff. Discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
You're all set? Thank you.
Thank you.
Next is to hear, to consider and if appropriate, approve a request from the Director of Elderly Services for the following budget transfer from office supplies, $964, and purchase services and repairs, $1,225. Transfer into furniture and fixtures, $2,189. Welcome, Dagmar.
Hello. What we're looking to do is reallocate some of our current fiscal year operating funds to furniture and fixtures to replace 6 of our activity tables that we've had for 25 or 30 years, and they're breaking down. So we're hoping you'll support that.
And these will go to the new location?
Yes, they will.
Questions of Dagmar on this? Been moved by Bob, seconded by Jeff. Discussion, all in favor? Aye. All set, Dex, thank you. Number 10 is to consider and if appropriate, approve a request from the Finance Director for the following budget transfers for fiscal 2019 as well as fiscal 20. So the first, I'll run through these. First, for fiscal 19, a transfer from interest payments, $90,000. Transfer out to Board of Ed Facilities Fund, $90,000. And a corresponding authorization transfer in of tennis courts and increase in the capital outlay for tennis courts on the expenditure side of $90,000. Related to that is a 2020 transfer from retirement, $162,400. Again, transferring out to Board of Ed facilities funds, and then corresponding transfer in within the capital funds of $162,400 with the authorization of a capital outlay of $162,400. Got a letter here from Jim explaining the nuances of the request. Jim, would you like to cover that?
Sure. Basically, the 2019 capital plan really had 2 projects for authorizations. One was the locker room repairs, and the other was the tennis courts. Back in August, we did a series of reauthorizations and deauthorizations. So we took care of the locker room repairs. But what we didn't do is we didn't add a debt authorization for the tennis courts. And that, at that time, that would have been $252,400. And we did, however, in our overall capital plan, identify that as a project that would require a debt authorization. Up to this point, we did not provide one to the Board of Finance for approval. So one of the things we could do now is we could actually go and ask for an authorization, or we can use operating funds from the old year and next year to cover it that way. Then you would avoid the additional debt. So if you work on the theme of avoiding debt, you're taking $90,000 from the interest payments, and then in the new year, you're taking $162 from the $201,000, which was put as a placeholder in the budget and approved by the RTM and the Board of Finance for the teachers' retirement system. Now, Peter is correct, Peter Black is correct when he says that in the past, money for the TRS went into the pension funds to augment our pension fundings. What's also correct is that the way we had accounted for the $2.7 million, which was the contribution under the previous administration in Hartford, is we split it. So we had half in debt service and we had half in pensions. And we ended up using it for both. We put $1 million into the pension fund, and then we used the debt side to reduce the amount we would have to borrow for the firehouse, if you guys may recall that. So we didn't actually do a debt authorization for the firehouse, or we reduced one because we decided not to borrow. So I guess we're both right. The accounting for the teachers' retirement system was used for two things, really. It was to put money into the pension plan and used to reduce future debt. And in this case, it's 162 for that is being used to reduce future debt.
So Jim, the interest for the current year, the current year, it's ending on the 30th, and $90,000 is not needed in that
Correct.
account?
Right.
So that will not be part of the, okay. Okay, questions from Jim on this?
Well, yeah, I guess, why wouldn't we move that 90 over rather than create more debt?
Well, you're not creating debt.
Well, no, basically what we're doing is we're using money that we would have initially planned that we might use to pay interest. And again, things get priced and things don't always work out. We try to be somewhat conservative in the way we approach this thing. So basically what we're doing is we're taking money out of the $90,000 is money that would go back to fund balance, but now it's being used to appropriate into a capital fund so that we don't have to borrow the $252,400.
I'm good with that.
So in this case, it's a pay-as-you-go.
It basically converts that from a debt to a pay-as-you-go.
We're paying it out of essentially fund balance because it's this $90,000 would go into fund balance if not otherwise reauthorized. And conceivably, the $162,000 would take the same path because it's not required because of the way the state finally ended up with their budget process. So it's fortunate for us that we actually have this flexibility, to be honest with you. Other questions, or?
I'll move it.
Been moved by Victor.
Second.
Seconded by Bob. Additional discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you, Jim, on that. Number 11 is to consider and if appropriate, approve various 2019 budget transfer requests from the Finance Director. I'll read through them. For Human Resources, from wages, $14,727, into seasonal and part-time, $14,000, and overtime, $650. For the Tax Collector, from wages and salaries, $4,700, from contingency, $12,765, transfer into seasonal and part-time, and $4,700, and accumulated sick of $12,765. For general government buildings, from wages and salaries, $15,934, into accumulated sick, $15,934. The same budget from workers for the Public Works Department, from wages and salaries, $56,200, into accumulated sick, $56,200. Engineering, from wages and salaries, $1,700, into accumulated sick, $1,700. From tax appeals and other legal, from contingency, $150,000, transfer into legal, $110,000, and tax appeals, $40,000. From, and within the debt service department, from interest payments, $280,125, into interest for general obligations of $85,955, and interest on schools for $194,170. And lastly, for municipal insurance, from property insurance, $17,000, from contingency, $23,000, into insurance damage, $40,000. And Jim has provided a memo on all of these items. Jim, you want to highlight these briefly one more time?
Sure. During the budget process, you heard a presentation from the new HR director, Margaret Liberta. She started with us in January, looking back over the fiscal year, which began in July. During some of that time, because the position was vacant, Joyce Forty, our former personnel director, was actually working on an acting basis, and her hours were charged to the seasonal and part-time help. So basically what this does is this takes the money that was budgeted as a full-time salary, for 12 months, and use that to offset the shortfall of the part-time help created by the vacancy of the HR director. Tax collector, in that case, we basically had an employee who had worked for the town for many years and had retired, and so that's a payout of contractually obligated sick time. This was an employee in the town hall union, and also there was $4,700 transferred to seasonal and part-time help. We were fortunate enough to get the services of Joanne Clary, our former tax collector, who was able to fill in because in addition to having the vacancy from the person that had retired, who worked here for many years, we also had an employee who was out on injury. And then coupled with that, because we have new employees in the tax office, they're required to go to training. So sometimes they're out of the office for training as well, and then you have vacations, et cetera. So like I said, Joanne was filling in for that, and the $4,700 reflected some of the time she was able to give us. General government buildings, all of us certainly can recall and remember Otto Berger. Otto Berger had retired, and so his collective bargaining agreement calls for a payout of sick time. Public Works, we had a couple employees retire who had accumulated large amounts of sick time. Engineering, there was a clerical person who had worked with us for not quite as many years, but also did have some accumulated sick payout. Normally, going forward, you'll probably, these type of requests will be presented by the HR director, but as she's new and getting adjusted, I'm sort of filling this transfer role for this year, and next year, you'll see her making those accumulated sick transfers typically. So, and then as we get into the tax appeals and legal, and I say this every year because essentially, a lot of these things are event-driven, especially on the top line, the 110,000. And we have a variety of cases that were going on during the year, in addition to the overall normal legal, which is, be it reviewing contracts, reviewing ordinances, giving opinions on matters, giving clean opinions for litigation or a opinion on litigation, whether it's for a bond prospectus or an audit. But there was about 6 other areas where, we incurred additional legal costs. We were being sued by the shoreline shellfish. We had the purchase of Tabor Drive, near Tabor Drive. That was the Zawalik property that occurred towards the beginning of this current year. We've had legal work with the Parkside Beacon, the housing authority, the housing development and the plans over by Foot Park. Crescent Bluff, which is an item that is on your agenda, which the selectmen will speak to. And then you have some zoning appeals. So, so if you look at that, and then you take into account the $230,000 budget for, the general counsel, legal advice, like I said, they're event-driven, and there's 6 events right there that added up to about $114,000. So the request is for $110,000, so you can kind of see how this is all kind of playing out, so.
And the debt service,
And then the tax appeals, that's a different area of the legal budget. There's about 5 matters that are still outstanding, but as you wind down on those matters, now these are things that aren't settled. People are preparing to go to court, et cetera, so they tend to get a little more expensive. The debt service, when the budget is adopted, basically, rather than try to project exactly what projects are going to be financed, et cetera, we have a line item that's just called interest payments. And because the town of Branford breaks down interest payments into general fund, sewers, clean water fund, and education, once we issue the debt, and then we look at what the bids were, what the interest costs are, then go back and allocate those to those functional areas. So essentially, it's taking, $280,000 and saying, okay, some of that was for the general fund, general obligation, basically the general category, and the other was for schools. And so that's just basically saying, when we adopt a budget, we don't know what buckets these are going to go in, so we're just going to create a big bucket, and then we're going to report out into the proper buckets once the year ends. And so that's what that one is. And then the municipal insurance, every year we do make some adjustments to this. We do collect revenue on the other side back from insurance companies, but sometimes the timing of getting the money back and the timing of the cost, sometimes they go over fiscal years. But essentially, we're out there. We're basically we drive police cars, we drive fire trucks. Sometimes we hit, like I say, sometimes we hit people, sometimes people hit us. And so when that happens, that's where we pay for this out of the insurance damage. And also, sometimes if there's a lawsuit, we have insurance. Depending on what it is, the insurance will defend us, but we have deductibles. So the deductibles also hit this account as well. I thought I had something on my desk that had a little bit more detail as to what those matters were, but I can send that to you at a later date if you like.
Thanks, Jim. Questions on these transfers?
No.
All set.
I'll move it.
Moved by Bob,
Second?
seconded by Victor. Discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye, and thanks, Jim, for the memo and explanation. Next is number 12, to consider a request from the First Selectman to fund the purchase of property at 16 Summer Island Road. Jamie, we'll just hear from you first, and then Jim has a way of addressing it financially if need be.
So I'm requesting that the board considers authorizing and appropriating $25,000 towards the purchase of 16 Summer Island Road. That includes $23,000 for the purchase of the property and $2,000 for any other incidental expenses that may be required as part of the transaction. I did forward the board an appraisal that we had done on this parcel back in 2016, when this particular piece of property was, we were trying to resolve a longstanding matter with the property. There was a berm on the property that was removed by somebody associated with the previous owner, or with the owner. They had parked a large RV on the site. The removal of the berm, not only was the RV a violation of zoning, but the removal of the berm created frequent nuisance flooding over Summer Island Road. So this particular parcel has about 170 feet of frontage along Summer Island Road. It also abuts Maltby Cove. It is primarily tidal and inland wetlands, but there is probably about 5,400 square feet of upland area. Again, this was the area, of those who are familiar with the neighborhoods know there's probably limited access down to those neighborhoods, in particular in an event of a storm. We had began reaching out to the owner about potentially purchasing it. The representative of the owner at the time was reluctant, would come back with a different number that really wasn't an opener for negotiations. Since this time, the property has gone into, the estate is now going through probate. That's why there was the delay in this. We did back in 2016, 17 it was, approach the probate judge, expressed in probate court our interest to purchase the property in the amount of the appraised amount for $23,000. And that now is getting ready to finalize the estate, and the attorney working for the estate has then approached the town to kind of wrap this up. That's why I'm before you today. And that is the delay for the last couple of years because it was going through, the estate was going through probate. So I think the benefit to the town is that, well, certainly in our control, we avoid these types of nuisance issues and secure the road that goes in front of this property from being flooded, which we did remedy that issue. It also avoids any further damage to the property, and I think looking at long-term, it would allow, if there's a marsh restoration or marsh migration project or any further resiliency efforts that are needed in that neighborhood, it would give us some ability to perform those. This did go before Planning and Zoning for an 824 referral last week, which it did receive a unanimous favorable report.
Thanks, Jamie. What I'll do is I'll just read a proposed resolution here, and then we could have discussion or questions. Resolved that the Board of Finance recommends to the RTM an increase in appropriation for fiscal 2020 general fund budget from $115,297,464 to $115,322,464. This increase will be funded through an increase in miscellaneous income and will be used to fund the transfer to the Land Acquisition Fund. And then on the corresponding Land Acquisition Fund, resolved that the Board of Finance recommend to the RTM an appropriation of $25,000 in the Land Acquisition Fund. This appropriation will be funded through a transfer from the general fund. And they have the corresponding appropriate accounts itemized in this memo. Questions from Jamie, and then Jim can maybe just explain some of the other mechanics of it. Bob?
Yeah, Jimmy, is the berm been replaced?
Yes.
Okay. So do we have to do anything at this point?
No.
Any idea why he removed the berm?
To access the upland area.
Oh,
So
okay.
that's where the
You can park the
RV
RV there.
RV was
Yeah,
there
okay.
for a couple of years, waterfront years.
Yeah.
Okay. Other questions on this?
I'll move it.
Been moved, okay.
Both resolutions.
Been moved by Victor. Somebody want to second?
I'll
this?
second it.
Second it, and then discussion. Jim, you have anything else to comment, or I think you're pretty self-explanatory with the memo? No other discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right, thank you. Number 13 is to hear an update from the Finance Director on some of the upcoming financial activities. I asked Jim to just kind of briefly touch on a few of the items that may impact us over the next couple of months. Jim?
Yeah, I think just to lead off, kind of take a quick step back and where we've been and kind of where we might be going and where some of the challenges are. I think it's fair to say over the past year we've solved our pension issue. So the RTM has approved changes to the police pension plan. We talked about those at a previous meeting. We've actually have a good funding strategy in place. We did put an additional $400,000+ in the pension fund back in March as one of the items that you voted on. We had a very favorable other post-employment benefit, or OPEB, presentation tonight. What that does not include was the dollars moved from the self-insurance fund, which will then go in. That'll be another $5 million to augment the fund. That'll improve our funded ratio even further. We've talked about trying to consider asset smoothing, and we've talked about ways to kind of improve the way the mechanics of that works, but we have to kind of go over that with our pension actuary and our investment folks. We did our first ever evaluation of the workers' comp fund. It looks like things are stable there. Obviously, they could change. The reason I say that is a lot of these things are things that kind of sink other entities, and we kind of have these things under control. We actually were able to move forward, and we set up the Coastal Resiliency Fund. The governor did sign that legislation, so that when we talked to the board in January in the RTM, we said we would be putting forth a legislative effort. That is now part of Connecticut law, so we were successful there, and many thanks to our State Senator Christine Cohn, Sean Scanlon, and Robin Comey, and a host of other people that co-signed and sponsored that legislation. So what are our challenges going forward? In the future, we have a revaluation. That could always be tricky. State budget challenges. We don't know if the teachers' retirement system could come back, or there could be changes in state aid. We know that there are pension increases down the road for our CMERS plan related to the change in assumptions by the State Retirement Commission, and we saw some of that in the operating budget that you just adopted. We have authorizations for the middle school, the library, and the community house that are still yet to be funded. Those are a shade under $50 million. Those are things that we did include in our debt plan, and we were looking to spread that out over a period of time. Again, a lot of this is to try to make it, budget sensitive, and so we don't have a lot of swings in these areas. But one of the things I think we'll be looking at, and I'm just advising the board, because as you know, when you approve your bond authorizations, the actual sizing and the structure of it is delegated to the finance director and first selectman, is we seem to be entering a sort of this period of interest rates, which I don't, at least speaking for myself, I don't think I would have ever foreseen. Probably about 6, 7, 8 months ago, the talk was how do we respond in a rising rate environment? The bond market has rallied quite a bit. So, when we're looking at some of the potential funding scenarios, one of the things I'm seriously looking at is doing a fairly large bond issue this summer. It would be larger than what was originally contemplated. But I think in the long term, I think it'll serve the town well. I also think that we'll look back on these days and we'll say, you know what, this was a good opportunity for us. So I think there's probably a window, and again, this can change, but certainly now and maybe within the next year to knock out a good portion of that, if not all of it, the $49.7 million. Having said that, we're still looking at the rest of our infrastructure. When we're looking at some of the community's needs, that's where we identified the school, we identified the community house, the library kind of grew out of its own needs and then came to the board. And we're making those investments into the community. We're also looking at some other areas that are critical to our service delivery. One is the roads. We're looking at our sewer collection system. We have made improvements over the years, but one of the pieces of the consent decree, which we are now out from under, is to basically camera the lines. And so when we're looking at the condition of some of the lines, working with our town engineer and working with the selectman's office and working with Dan Gregory, you know, there's some areas that we need to address. And same with our roads. And there's some other things that are kind of lurking out there. The RTM heard a presentation on possibly acquiring a property through eminent domain. The Brantford Point dock, pier, wharf, whatever it's called. We're having an engineer look at that because we see some erosion there and some improvements that need to be made there. So basically, it doesn't mean we're just going to stop doing things. So probably the next meeting or the meeting thereafter, we'll be asking for small authorizations. When I say small, relative to the 50 million, probably be somewhere in the area of 5 million or a little bit less, to embark on or upgrading our roads and also doing work with the sewer lines. Clearly, it's not all coming from that. We have other funding sources. Those funding sources are being put into the plan. But again, this is just kind of giving the Board of Finance a heads up as to some of the things that we're looking at, so that when folks see what we're looking at, you know, they won't be surprised. Because I think sometimes we focus on the big projects, but all these other areas of the government still need to be looked at and still need some work. When you hear about the 50 million in debt being issued, or 55 potentially over the next 2 years, currently, when we end this fiscal year, we'll probably be down to about 50 million in debt. And then so if we issue 55 over the next years, and we're also going to have pay downs that occur in between, we'll be somewhere in the 90 million range, which is when we were doing some of our debt planning, we knew we would get up that high. But the other aspect of this is, well, what's the overall cost of this? So if we can secure some of this borrowing at decent interest rates, I think in the long run, it'll serve the town well. Obviously, those decisions will be judged in hindsight. But, when we authorized those projects, we knew that we would basically be compelled to finance them. What we didn't know is what rates were going to be. So, again, we're not market timers in Brantford. We never have been. We usually issue when we need money. And this is certainly, we're not doing this in speculation, because we know we're going to need to be issuing large amounts in the next couple of years. It's just a matter of saying, okay, is this a good entry point? And we don't make these decisions in a vacuum either. We work with a financial advisor as well. So, again, it's not really a formal presentation. It's just letting you know that we're embarking on some things. We're cognizant of the budget impact. We're trying to take advantage of certain conditions and use that to continue to make investments in our liabilities, whether that liability is a pension liability, OPEB liability, or if it's a liability because your infrastructure is not being maintained. So that's kind of the theme. It's not a new theme. It's really just to say that it's going to continue. There's other mountains to conquer, and that's what we're kind of looking to do. So,
Thanks, Jim, for that update. Questions from Jim at this point? Charlie?
Yeah, I got. Hey, Jim, when Public Act 1977, which was the climate change and coastal resiliency, what did that allow you to invest in that's different what you now do?
Sure, because that is a key component of this. Our approach to this was that, this was potentially a longer-term liability, and that we should basically, just like we do in a pension fund, when we do our asset allocation, we identify the longer-term payouts to more aggressive investing. So in other words, let's take the pension, for example. You hire a police officer on day one. Well, when that officer retires, let's call it 30 years from now, we're funding that. But those pieces, for the outer years, are invested more aggressively. The folks that are currently receiving a pension, the folks that are soon to retire, those assets would be invested more conservatively. And when you look at the landscape of state statutes in terms of, how would we set up a coastal resiliency fund, there's really only a handful of ways to do it. You can, one, get a grant, which means somebody else pays for it. You could actually pay as you go. In other words, okay, we're going to do this project, we're going to take it out of our general fund. You could set up a sinking fund, and the sinking funds, generally speaking, the way most communities would use a sinking fund, and we do this with our public works sinking fund, where this would be the same case with the Bulletproof Vest Fund or the Fire Apparatus Fund. They're invested in conservative investments, pursuant to state statute. Now, there are some reserve statutes out there for capital projects. The highest amount that you can invest under those is 31%. Okay? So by being able to go to 50%, which doesn't, and that's having an asset allocation plan that's approved by the town. If not, it's 40%. We looked at, well, what is the difference in that? And one of the things in the presentation that was made to the state of Connecticut was we addressed that specific point. And we cited a study from the Vanguard group that I think went from 1926 to 2017. And we looked and we said, okay, what does a 30% stock allocation, 70% bond allocation do? And if you had done that over that period of time, how much would $1 million grow to? And then we said, okay, what would a 50%, how much would $1 million grow to? Now, again, we all know that probably the bond portfolio had less volatility. But again, if you're looking at putting money aside for the long term, having that investment options available to you makes a big difference. The way I would explain it to the average guy in the street is, current ways of investing for this would be like a Christmas club. This is more like an IRA. And so if you look at it that way, if somebody's looking, for my daughter's looking to retire, she's going to be investing more aggressively than, say, I would be. Did I answer your question about why we did this?
Yeah, so we increased the amount from 31 to 37% for...
Well, right now, there was no statute specifically for this purpose. We didn't want to go hog wild and just say all municipalities can create reserve funds and invest at 50%, because we knew we'd get some pushback. As it turned out, we were getting pushback on the statute anyway. So what we did is we wanted to tie it to a specific need, and for a coastal community, we identified that need as sea level rise. Another community may identify it as something else, related to changes in climate change. And again, I'm not trying to argue the science of it. I know that's a popular debate in society today, but our approach was more mechanical in nature and saying, well, okay, if I got this liability out there and we think that the situation is liable to gradually get worse than better, well, if I'm setting money aside in 2019 for things I may need to spend in 2039, well, how would I construct this portfolio and what would be appropriate to meet those long-term liabilities? And that's what this statute does. Among other things, it allows us to be able to do that more effectively than the Christmas Club or traditional sinking fund. When we do a sinking fund for police vehicles or fire trucks, well, or radios, well, we're going to be making that purchase relatively soon, right? So we want to make sure that our investment basically preserves the purchasing power. And, so maybe we're a little bit under. So our actuary tonight said that the Social Security Administration is using 2.6 as a number. So we're actually looking at it, so we're not getting 2.6 on average, but close enough that it makes up for most of the inflation. But if you're looking at something that, 30 years out, 20 years out, this is a more appropriate vehicle. It's just another tool in the tool chest with addition to the grants and issuing bonds and doing a regular sinking fund. This provides the fourth lever. So,
Thanks, Jim. Other questions from Jim? Good. Charlie, you're all set?
yeah.
Okay. Very good. Thanks, Jim. With no other business to come before the board, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved. Second.
Been moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you.
This program was brought to you in part through the support of the Town of Brantford. Watch town meetings and other videos on demand at BrantfordTV.org.